She grew up in a tight-knit neighborhood. It was the kind of place where your neighbor would look after you when school let out, where your first grade teacher would show up at your law school graduation. It's where Kamala Harris learned what it means to be in the middle class, making every paycheck count. She was raised by a working mom who taught her about standing up for what's right and protecting the people you love.
Kamala carries the lessons of our mother, the fighting spirit of our mother, the compassion.
She was all of 5 feet tall. If you met her, you would have thought she was 7 feet tall. And our mother, if I'd ever come home complaining about anything, she wouldn't have it. The first thing she'd say is, well, just stop the complaining. Just tell me what you're going to do about it.
And since she was a young girl, Kamala Harris has been fighting for families like the ones she grew up with.
That is Kamala. She can't help herself from standing up for people and standing up for what she thinks is right. She has been that way our whole lives. Being a protector is what led her to become a prosecutor. Looking back now, I could say it was her calling.
As a courtroom prosecutor, she went after predators who targeted women and children, and fraudsters who ripped off working families. And she put dangerous gang members and human traffickers behind bars.
We didn't have partnerships with DOJ or FBI or DEA or any of those law enforcement agencies. Now, we all work collaboratively. She was the person who built the foundation in how we do criminal justice in America.
As Attorney General of California, she held the big Wall Street banks accountable for fraud, winning $20 billion for California families. She took on one of the largest for-profit colleges that was scamming students. And in the Senate, she fought for her constituents with the determination of a prosecutor, standing up for reproductive freedom.
Can you think of any laws that give the government the power to make decisions about the male body?
I'm not thinking of any right now, Senator.
She fought to keep our children safe from the terror of gun violence.
How many of you guys had to have a drill where you learned about how you need to hide in a closet or crouch in a corner in the event that there is a mass shooter? Look at that. Look at that.
On the Intelligence Committee, she defended our nation against foreign adversaries. And in 2020, she made history as the first woman to be elected Vice President of the United States. She cast the tie-breaking vote to deliver urgent relief to the American people during the pandemic. She beat Big Pharma to lower prescription drug costs and cap the cost of insulin, and led the fight to restore reproductive rights after Roe v. Wade was overturned.
We have worked too hard and fought too long to see our daughters grow up in a world with fewer rights than our mothers.
Because she's never been afraid to stand up to powerful interests.
Sometimes people will open the door for you and leave it open, sometimes they won't. And then you need to kick that door down. Excuse my language.
Now, she's running for president, still fighting for families like the one she grew up with.
Our campaign is about saying we trust the people. We're saying we just want fairness. We want dignity for all people. And we are a work in progress. We haven't yet quite reached all of those ideals, but we will die trying because we love our country. We believe in our country. We're not falling for these folks who are trying to divide us, trying to pull us apart. We know what we stand for, and we stand for the people, and we stand for the dignity of work, and we stand for freedom. We stand for justice. We stand for equality. And so we will fight for all of it.
That's who Kamala Harris is. That's what she believes, and that's what she'll fight for every day.
Keep on running, cause the winner don't quit on themselves.
Please welcome the Democratic nominee for president, Vice President of the United States of America, Kamala Harris.
Freedom, freedom, I can't move. Freedom.
you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, everyone, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you all. Thank you all. Okay, we gotta get to some business. We gotta get to some business. Okay, thank you all. Okay. Thank you, 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 please, thank you, please, thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Okay, let's get to business. Let's get to business. All right. So let me start by thanking my most incredible husband, Doug, for being an incredible partner to me, an incredible father to Cole and Ella, and happy anniversary, Dougie. I love you so very much. To our President, Joe Biden. When I think about the path that we have traveled together, Joe, I am filled with gratitude. Your record is extraordinary, as history will show, and your character is inspiring. And Doug and I love you and Jill and are forever thankful to you both. And to Coach Tim Walz, you are going to be an incredible vice president. And to the delegates and everyone who has put your faith in our campaign, your support is humbling. So, America, the path that led me here in recent weeks was no doubt unexpected. But I'm no stranger to unlikely journeys. So, my mother, our mother, Kamala Harris, had one of her own. And I miss her every day, and especially right now. And I know she's looking down, smiling. I know that. So my mother was 19 when she crossed the world alone, traveling from India to California with an unshakable dream to be the scientist who would cure breast cancer. When she finished school, she was supposed to return home to a traditional arranged marriage. But as fate would have it, she met my father, Donald Harris, a student from Jamaica. They fell in love and got married, and that act of self-determination made my sister Maya and me. Growing up, we moved a lot. I will always remember that big Mayflower truck packed with all our belongings, ready to go to Illinois, to Wisconsin, and wherever our parents' jobs took us. My early memories of our parents together are very joyful ones. A home filled with laughter and music, Aretha, Coltrane, and Miles. At the park, my mother would say, "Stay close." But my father would say, as he smiled, "Run, Kamala, run. Don't be afraid. Don't let anything stop you." From my earliest years, he taught me to be fearless. But the harmony between my parents did not last. When I was in elementary school, they split up. And it was mostly my mother who raised us. Before she could finally afford to buy a home, she rented a small apartment in the East Bay. In the Bay, you either live in the hills or the flatlands. We lived in the flats. A beautiful, working-class neighborhood, of firefighters, nurses, and construction workers, all who tended their lawns with pride. My mother, she worked long hours, and like many working parents, she leaned on a trusted circle to help raise us. Mrs. Shelton, who ran the daycare below us and became a second mother. Uncle Sherman, Aunt Mary, Uncle Freddie, Auntie Chris. None of them family by blood, and all of them family by love. Family who taught us how to make gumbo, how to play chess, and sometimes even let us win. Family who loved us, believed in us, and told us we could be anything and do anything. They instilled in us the values they personified: community, faith, and the importance of treating others as you would want to be treated, with kindness, respect, and compassion. My mother was a brilliant, 5-foot-tall brown woman with an accent. And as the eldest child, I saw how the world would sometimes treat her. But my mother never lost her cool. She was tough, courageous, a trailblazer in the fight for women's health, and she taught Maya and me a lesson that Michelle mentioned the other night. She taught us to never complain about injustice, but do something about it. Do something about it. That was my mother. And she taught us, and she also taught us, and never do anything half-assed. And that is a direct quote. A direct quote. I grew up immersed in the ideals of the civil rights movement. My parents had met at a civil rights gathering, and they made sure that we learned about civil rights leaders, including the lawyers like Thurgood Marshall and Constance Baker Motley, those who battled in the courtroom to make real the promise of America. So at a young age, I decided I wanted to do that work. I wanted to be a lawyer. And when it came time to choose the type of law I would pursue, I reflected on a pivotal moment in my life. You see, when I was in high school, I started to notice something about my best friend, Wanda. She was sad at school, and there were times she didn't want to go home. So one day I asked if everything was all right, and she confided in me that she was being sexually abused by her stepfather. And I immediately told her she had to come stay with us, and she did. This is one of the reasons I became a prosecutor, to protect people like Wanda, because I believe everyone has a right to safety, to dignity, and to justice. As a prosecutor, when I had a case, I charged it not in the name of the victim, but in the name of the people. For a simple reason. In our system of justice, a harm against any one of us is a harm against all of us. And I would often explain this to console survivors of crime, to remind them no one should be made to fight alone. We are all in this together. And every day, in the courtroom, I stood proudly before a judge, and I said 5 words: Kamala Harris for the people. And to be clear, my entire career, I've only had one client, the people. And so, on behalf of the people, on behalf of every American, regardless of party, race, gender, or the language your grandmother speaks, on behalf of my mother and everyone who has ever set out on their own unlikely journey, on behalf of Americans like the people I grew up with, people who work hard, chase their dreams, and look out for one another, on behalf of everyone whose story could only be written in the greatest nation on earth, I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America. And with this election, our nation with this election has a precious, fleeting opportunity to move past the bitterness, cynicism, and divisive battles of the past, a chance to chart a new way forward. Not as members of any one party or faction, but as Americans. And let me say, I know there are people of various political views watching tonight, and I want you to know, I promise to be a president for all Americans. You can always trust me to put country above party and self, to hold sacred America's fundamental principles, from the rule of law to free and fair elections to the peaceful transfer of power. I will be a president who unites us around our highest aspirations, a president who leads and listens, who is realistic, practical, and has common sense, and always fights for the American people. From the courthouse to the White House, that has been my life's work. As a young courtroom prosecutor in Oakland, California, I stood up for women and children against predators who abuse them. As Attorney General of California, I took on the big banks, delivered $20 billion for middle-class families who faced foreclosure, and helped pass a homeowner Bill of Rights, one of the first of its kind in the nation. I stood up for veterans and students being scammed by big for-profit colleges, for workers who are being cheated out of their wages, the wages they were due, for seniors facing elder abuse. I fought against the cartels who traffic in guns and drugs and human beings, who threaten the security of our border and the safety of our communities. And I will tell you, these fights were not easy, and neither were the elections that put me in those offices. We were underestimated at practically every turn, but we never gave up, because the future is always worth fighting for. And that's the fight we are in right now. fight for America's future. Fellow Americans, this election is not only the most important of our lives, it is one of the most important in the life of our nation. In many ways, Donald Trump is an unserious man. But the consequences of putting Donald Trump back in the White House are extremely serious. Consider not only the chaos and calamity when he was in office, but also the gravity of what has happened since he lost the last election. Donald Trump tried to throw away your votes. When he failed, he sent an armed mob to the United States Capitol, where they assaulted law enforcement officers. When politicians in his own party begged him to call off the mob and send help, he did the opposite. He fanned the flames. And now, for an entirely different set of crimes, he was found guilty of fraud by a jury of everyday Americans and separately found liable for committing sexual abuse. And consider what he intends to do if we give him power again. Consider his explicit intent to set free violent extremists who assaulted those law enforcement officers at the Capitol. His explicit intent to jail journalists, political opponents, and anyone he sees as the enemy. His explicit intent to deploy our active duty military against our own citizens. Consider the power he will have, especially after the United States Supreme Court just ruled that he would be immune from criminal prosecution. Just imagine Donald Trump with no guardrails, and how he would use the immense powers of the presidency of the United States, not to improve your life, not to strengthen our national security, but to serve the only client he has ever had, himself. And we know what a second Trump term would look like. It's all laid out in Project 2025, written by his closest advisors, and its sum total is to pull our country back to the past. But America, we are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back. We are not going back to when Donald Trump tried to cut Social Security and Medicare. We are not going back to when he tried to get rid of the Affordable Care Act, when insurance companies could deny people with pre-existing conditions. We are not going to let him eliminate the Department of Education that funds our public schools. We are not going to let him end programs like Head Start that provide preschool and child care for our children. America, we are not going back. And we are charting a new way forward. Forward to a future with a strong and growing middle class, because we know a strong middle class has always been critical to America's success. And building that middle class will be a defining goal of my presidency. And I'll tell you, this is personal for me. The middle class is where I come from. My mother kept a strict budget. We lived within our means, yet we wanted for little. And she expected us to make the most of the opportunities that were available to us and to be grateful for them. Because, as she taught us, opportunity is not available to everyone. That's why we will create what I call an opportunity economy where everyone has the chance to compete and a chance to succeed. Whether you live in a rural area, small town, or big city. And as president, I will bring together labor and workers and small business owners and entrepreneurs and American companies to create jobs, to grow our economy, and to lower the cost of everyday needs like health care and housing and groceries. We will provide access to capital for small business owners and entrepreneurs and founders. And we will end America's housing shortage and protect Social Security and Medicare. Now compare that to Donald Trump, because I think everyone here knows he doesn't actually fight for the middle class. He doesn't actually fight for the middle class. Instead, he fights for himself and his billionaire friends. And he will give them another round of tax breaks that will add up to $5 trillion to the national debt. And all the while, he intends to enact what in effect is a national sales tax, call it a Trump tax, that would raise prices on middle-class families by almost $4,000 a year. Well, instead of a Trump tax hike, we will pass a middle-class tax cut that will benefit more than 100 million Americans. Friends, I believe America cannot truly be prosperous unless Americans are fully able to make their own decisions about their own lives, especially on matters of heart and home. But tonight, in America, too many women are not able to make those decisions. And let's be clear about how we got here. Donald Trump handpicked members of the United States Supreme Court to take away reproductive freedom. And now he brags about it. In his words, quote, "I did it and I'm proud to have done it," end quote. Well, I'll tell you, over the past 2 years, I've traveled across our country, and women have told me their stories. Husbands and fathers have shared theirs. Stories of women miscarrying in a parking lot, developing sepsis, losing the ability to ever again have children, all because doctors are afraid they may go to jail for caring for their patients. Couples just trying to grow their family, cut off in the middle of IVF treatments. Children who have survived sexual assault, potentially being forced to carry a pregnancy to term. This is what's happening in our country because of Donald Trump. And understand, he is not done. As a part of his agenda, he and his allies would limit access to birth control, ban medication abortion, and enact a nationwide abortion ban with or without Congress. And get this, he plans to create a national anti-abortion coordinator and force states to report on women's miscarriages and abortions. Simply put, they are out of their minds. And one must ask, why exactly is it that they don't trust women? Well, we trust women. We trust women. And when Congress passes a bill to restore reproductive freedom, as President of the United States, I will proudly sign it into law. In this election, many other fundamental freedoms are at stake. The freedom to live safe from gun violence in our schools, communities, and places of worship. The freedom to love who you love openly and with pride. The freedom to breathe clean air and drink clean water and live free from the pollution that fuels the climate crisis. And the freedom that unlocks all the others, the freedom to vote. With this election, we finally have the opportunity to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And let me be clear, after decades in law enforcement, I know the importance of safety and security, especially at our border. Last year, Joe and I brought together Democrats and conservative Republicans to write the strongest border bill in decades. The Border Patrol endorsed it. But Donald Trump believes a border deal would hurt his campaign. So he ordered his allies in Congress to kill the deal. Well, I refuse to play politics with our security, and here is my pledge to you. As president, I will bring back the bipartisan border security bill that he killed, and I will sign it into law. I know we can live up to our proud heritage as a nation of immigrants and reform our broken immigration system. We can create an earned pathway to citizenship and secure our border. And America, we must also be steadfast in advancing our security and values abroad. As Vice President, I have confronted threats to our security, negotiated with foreign leaders, strengthened our alliances, and engaged with our brave troops overseas. As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world. And I will fulfill our sacred obligation to care for our troops and their families, and I will always honor and never disparage their service and their sacrifice. I will make sure that we lead the world into the future on space and artificial intelligence, that America, not China, wins the competition for the 21st century, and that we strengthen, not abdicate, our global leadership. Trump, on the other hand, threatened to abandon NATO. He encouraged Putin to invade our allies, said Russia could, quote, do whatever the hell they want. 5 days before Russia attacked Ukraine, I met with President Zelensky to warn him about Russia's plan to invade. I helped mobilize a global response, over 50 countries, to defend against Putin's aggression. And as president, I will stand strong with Ukraine and our NATO allies. With respect to the war in Gaza, President Biden and I are working around the clock, because now is the time to get a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal done. And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7, including unspeakable sexual violence and the massacre of young people at a music festival. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination. And know this, I will never hesitate to take whatever action is necessary to defend our forces and our interests against Iran and Iran-backed terrorists. I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un, who are rooting for Trump, Because, you know, they know he is easy to manipulate with flattery and favors. They know Trump won't hold autocrats accountable because he wants to be an autocrat himself. And as president, I will never waver in defense of America's security and ideals, because in the enduring struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand and I know where the United States belongs. I love our country with all my heart. Everywhere I go, in everyone I meet, I see a nation that is ready to move forward, ready for the next step in the incredible journey that is America. I see an America where we hold fast to the fearless belief that built our nation and inspired the world, that here in this country, anything is possible, that nothing is out of reach. An America where we care for one another, look out for one another, and recognize that we have so much more in common than what separates us. That none of us has to fail for all of us to succeed. And that in unity there is strength. You know, our opponents in this race are out there every day denigrating America, talking about how terrible everything is. Well, my mother had another lesson she used to teach. Never let anyone tell you who you are. You show them who you are. America, let us show each other and the world who we are and what we stand for. Freedom, opportunity, compassion, dignity, fairness, and endless possibilities. We are the heirs to the greatest democracy in the history of the world. And on behalf of our children and our grandchildren and all those who sacrificed so dearly for our freedom and liberty, we must be worthy of this moment. It is now our turn to do what generations before us have done, guided by optimism and faith, to fight for this country we love, to fight for the ideals we cherish, and to uphold the awesome responsibility that comes with the greatest privilege on earth, the privilege and pride of being an American. So let's get out there, let's fight for it, let's get out there, let's vote for it, and together, let us write the next great chapter in the most extraordinary story ever told. Thank you. God bless you, and may God bless the United States of America. Thank you all.
Beyonce a moment ago. There had been speculation that she'd be performing live. This is a recording, as best I can tell so far. Let's see whether Beyonce does in fact appear. As she does, we'll bring that to you. It's political pageantry at its finest. I suppose Republican supporters would say the same of their own national convention too. But there is much to assess about what we just heard and what lies ahead for the Harris-Walz campaign. I'm Greg Jennett. We have extended coverage of this moment in history to bring to you. And to do that, we'll be joined by ABC analysts and expert commentators as we pull apart the Harris speech and look at the challenge of the next 10 weeks ahead. Plenty to get through. We'll keep those pictures rolling, but let's begin. We'll go to Canberra in just a moment, where our political lead and Insiders host, David Speers, is standing by. First, though, joining me in the studio, colleague, writer and broadcaster Julia Baird. Julia, what a moment we're witnessing here.
What a moment. A lot of energy, a lot of enthusiasm, a very kind of safe and sober and determined speech. She said that her mother told her, don't let other people tell you who you are, you show who you are, and she tried to do exactly that. Everything that the Republicans have been saying she is, she tried to counter in her speech tonight.
Crisply and concisely. One of the criticisms made by her opponents, of course, is that she has been unable to articulate what it is she stands for, and yet at least on the values front, that was front and centre in this presentation.
Well, what was fascinating was to watch her say both, I'm a candidate of change and I have all this experience as vice president, and yet I'm also just going to continue really the Biden agenda, essentially. So she's kind of trying to balance both of those things, and the only part of Biden's agenda that she specifically and explicitly aligned herself with was his work around trying to gain an alliance to help with the war in Ukraine.
Yes, and we might elaborate on that further, because foreign policy, as I just noted, came across pretty strongly. And speaking of Joe Biden, really apart from that policy continuity towards the end, he got only a cursory mention, you might have noticed,
yes,
Julia, right at the outset, as you would expect, but it was cursory.
Yes, but let's not forget she also turned up unexpectedly when he spoke a couple of nights ago, so perhaps that was intended to counter what she was trying to do so hard tonight, which was refocus on Kamala, who, as she said, leads for the people.
That party goes on in Chicago. We'll bring as much of it to you as we can. We're on a wide shot right now, but clearly Kamala Harris not in a rush to go anywhere. There she remains with friends, family and key supporters, those who will sustain her over the 10 weeks ahead. All right, David Speers, the Insiders host and our ABC national political lead, has been watching on from Canberra. David, great to get your thoughts once again on this spectacle. By far the most expansive presentation of Kamala Harris, I would have thought, to the American people so far. We are talking, aren't we, David, about a compressed period of time here since she became the nominee. Against those recent criticisms that somehow she's been coddled by minders and the campaign machine, did she do what she needed to do to broaden out the appeal and the knowledge of her?
Look, a few things. I mean, what a moment, what a month Kamala Harris has had, but what a moment this is. Biggest speech of her career. And what a week it's been at that Democrat National Convention. The hype there, and you can see it right now, it has been, a star-studded lineup of all the Democrats, greatest figures, the Obamas, the Clintons and so on, Oprah Winfrey. But this is the moment that it's been building to. Look, yes, she still needs to do interviews, press conferences, explain, answer questions on things like Gaza. But for this event, the speech, I thought she's done a good job here. Contrast this with Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the Republican convention, which ran for a record length of time, I think the Harris speech here was much tighter, much crisper. She spent quite a bit of time introducing herself, talking about her childhood, talking about her parents, talking about the working class, or as they say, middle class roots. So I think she wanted to spend a fair bit of time there. This freedom ideal that we've heard all week at this convention, the Democrats really trying to seize this issue from the right in American politics. The freedom to have clean air, clean water, the freedom, we've heard from other speakers, for kids to go to school without being shot. They're trying to take the ideal of freedom and make it their own. She addressed the vulnerability the Democrats clearly have on the borders, took that on head on, and I thought she spent quite a bit of time on foreign policy as well, on Ukraine, on Gaza. We can unpack that a bit, but really, culminating in that line that between tyranny and democracy, she knows where she stands, painting Donald Trump as the autocrat. Yes, she did spend some time attacking Trump. I don't think she went over the top, though. There are risks for the Democrats to spend too much time on that. I thought she's done a pretty good job there.
Yeah, I think a theme you might have picked up throughout the week, David, was one of minimal reference to Trump, more making him the subject of ridicule, I suppose, than contempt. In that way, it's a more productive channeling of the vitriol, I suppose, if you can bring humour into it. Bill Clinton did that, I thought.
Bill Clinton did that. Barack Obama did that very effectively when he was talking about the size of crowds and so on, got a lot of laughs. Look, Kamala Harris didn't go as much on the mockery, but clearly that has been an interesting shift in strategy from the Democrats as a whole, I think, in the way they're approaching Trump. I thought Kamala Harris went back a bit more to the serious consequences that are at stake in this election. What would happen if he's back, particularly not just the chaos, she said, of the first Trump presidency, but the violence that we saw on January 6th and letting some of those violent extremists free from jail, going after the retribution Trump has talked about, going after his enemies. All of this was getting back to a more serious tone in talking about what's at stake in this election.
Yeah, I'm also interested in the fact of what she did not say today. Notice she spoke about reproductive rights, but she did not say, I'm going to be the first woman to break through this. She didn't talk about glass ceilings. There was a lot of people wearing white with a suggestion this was a suffragette white. It was done deliberately so. But when we had the Republican convention, it was so overtly stereotypically masculine. We had Kid Rock playing, we had Hulk Hogan literally ripping his shirt open to reveal his muscles. There was a lot of kind of aggro. What you notice here is the women that have been spoken about. Marion Robinson, Michelle Obama's mother, the values that she taught. Kamala Harris, the values that her mother taught. Raising children in kind of middle-class America and working throughout. We saw Barack Obama saying, I drew the short straw, I have to follow after Michelle here. We saw Mark Kelly following after Gabby Gifford. And I think seeing the face of people like Doug Emhoff in the crowd, I think it's a fundamental shift that is more inclusive, more generally, of women, and not just as a ploy, but women as authorities politically. And I think that's really significant here.
Maybe let's go ahead, Dave.
Julie's made a good point there too, that I don't think Kamala Harris in the speech itself, she wasn't wearing, the suffragette white. She wasn't talking explicitly about race. I think there were, undeniable references through her upbringing when she talks about it. But she's not playing these cards in the way that perhaps Republicans, who've derided her as the diversity choice and so on. I think she's wanting to present herself not as a candidate based on race or gender, even though they are undeniable factors here. But the speech in itself didn't dwell, I don't think, on those.
And yet the line on reproductive freedoms, Julia, was unmistakably strong. Sure, it might have been concise within the 41 minutes. I think I timed it out about 41 minutes, but it was unmissable.
And part of it being unmissable because it is the foil that provides to the way that Joe Biden spoke about it.
The closing prayer,
out of the narrow place of oppression to freedom. Let's remember the treacherous road our ancestors traveled to freedom, their sacrifice and resolve to bring a better, more inclusive world. We stand on their shoulders to declare we are not going back.
But here of faith that was rooted in values.
God who notices the downtrodden.
Yeah, we may not take all of the closing prayer. It is important, of course, but that is pretty pro forma in all of these conventions. So just to continue that analysis, Julia?
When Kamala Harris speaks about women's reproductive rights, she does it in a way that has significantly more heft than Joe Biden was ever able to summons. No matter which words he said, we knew that they weren't necessarily rooted in long-term conviction. She can say things like, why don't you trust women? Like, we trust women. And those kinds of statements, I think, really land. The spectre, as she said, of Donald Trump without guardrails and what that might mean for the monitoring of women's bodies. Again, when you referred to before, are they out of their minds? That goes back to that weirdness stuff. This is just a weird way to be around women. That's how she was presenting it.
No, it was a very bleak construction she put around an uncontrolled Donald Trump. At least this was her presentation to the party faithful second time around on all manner of fronts, but particularly reproductive health. Look, we are hoping to go to our very hard-working team on the ground in Chicago, and we'll catch up with one of our correspondents there at the DNC shortly as it wraps up. But in the meantime, we want to bring in now the ABC's elections analyst, Casey Briggs, who is in Washington. Casey's up on Capitol Hill. Casey, we welcome you to the program. You've been able to monitor it, well, closer than we are, but from afar. In fact, you've kept a close eye on all 4 days of this political pageantry. Your overall assessment about the job that needed to be done for the Democrats out of these 4 days. Set the starting line for us for the campaign to go ahead from here.
Yeah, evening, Greg. A safe distance away from the convention, some might say, but we are here monitoring things in the United States. The big picture, let's start with, and just reflect on what a remarkable reset of the race that Kamala Harris has managed to do here. A month ago, Joe Biden was supposed to be the headliner on this day. We were going to hear probably a very different speech, well, certainly a very different speech from him. I think we got a flavour of what that speech is. Some emergency vehicles just come behind us here at the Capitol building in the United States. But minor distraction there. But we heard a flavour of what Joe Biden would have talked about in his speech on Monday, and then he vacated the convention entirely, ceded it to the new nominee, who has done, we should just say, just such a remarkable job in resetting this race. This is a race now that really is very competitive. Kamala Harris has managed to claw back that deficit that Joe Biden saw in the polls, is now, according to basically all the polling averages out there, ahead. For example, in the Economist polling average, 3 percentage points ahead of Donald Trump on a national level. In the battleground states, is ahead or competitive in virtually all of them now. In the last few weeks, I've been speaking with Democratic Party strategists here in the United States. Many of them have said, thank goodness Joe Biden did eventually step down. They were fearing the worst, not just a defeat, but a landslide, no hope of winning the House back, the likelihood of losing the Senate as well. And they would be very worried about what Donald Trump would do if he controlled all 3 of those power-making, bodies, both the legislative and the executive branch. Now they're much more hopeful of not just retaining some of that, but potentially winning some or all of those 3. And it's been a really interesting campaign reset to watch because it's so vibes-based. It's been really tapping into the enthusiasm that Democrats had been so sorely lacking a month ago. And they just now feel so excited and so enthusiastic about this new candidate that they haven't had to do the difficult things that David was mentioning earlier, press conferences and interviews, because what they're doing now is working. This convention was a party. This convention was an attempt to keep those vibes going, to keep riding that wave as far as possible. They wheeled out as many celebrities and musical performers as they could. Sort of less star power today, we should say. I think they maybe wanted Kamala Harris to be the main attraction. Of course, a few big stars like Pink, for example, and the Chicks. But the strategy seems to be keep the good times rolling as long as possible, because they're in this sort of race at the moment to define Kamala Harris before Donald Trump can define her for them. You know, think back to 2019 in Australian politics. Scott Morrison was very successful at defining the then Labor leader, Bill Shorten, in his preferred terms, and that definitely contributed to Bill Shorten's defeat, surprise defeat in that election. Well, Donald Trump's trying to define Kamala Harris how he would like. So far, he's been far less successful than Scott Morrison. But of course, there will be challenges ahead. There will be, you know, a presidential debate, which is scheduled for next month. There'll be interviews and press conferences, I'm sure. But I think the Democrats are trying to ride that wave of vibes long enough that it builds them up a cushion so that when things do come back to earth, this is politics, things will eventually come back to earth, they have a bit of a cushion to land on.
I'm sure your analysis is spot on there, Casey. Honeymoon periods, as they're called, they never last forever, do they? But defining yourself as a political character or identity is the task at the outset, and she's only had 4 weeks to do it. Hold those thoughts. I've got other questions for you, Casey, but we do want to jump over to Chicago now. Our North America correspondent, Carrington Clark, has been at the Democratic National Convention at the United Centre all week, and Carrington joins us. Welcome to the program, Carrington. Wow, so that was the final wrap-up. Not the longest presentation we've heard by a political leader in this campaign or in previous years, but I guess no matter what was said, it was all going to go down pretty sweetly with the delegates gathered there.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, Greg. I mean, I think it is hard to exaggerate just how much Kamala Harris's ascent to the top of this ticket has completely transformed this race. And although the vice president still claims the underdog tag, it's clear that the people in this room have this palpable sense of optimism. They know that the polls have tightened, and they genuinely believe that they are going to win this thing, that America is ready to elect its first female president. Kamala Harris had a lot of support this week. She had a lot of people giving very impressive speeches. Some of the best American orators in recent decades were effectively the warm-up acts. She doesn't necessarily have the same gift as, say, Barack or Michelle Obama. But what she did do today was probably assuage concerns of some of those people who maybe weren't as convinced of her background or her qualifications for the job, that she was a steady hand. She really leaned into her prosecutorial experience, selling herself as this a woman who is tough on crime, and would keep America safe. This is one of the major attacks from the Republicans, from Donald Trump, that somehow there will be chaos if Kamala Harris is elected. She has had this very interesting career. She was a prosecutor, but then when she ran for the Senate in California, she kind of had to move more to the left and became much more focused on things like racial justice and other issues that are very important to the progressive wing of this party. But she kind of sits naturally more in the central part of the American political spectrum. And it's actually been a fortunate set of circumstances that she didn't have this bruising primary season in order to take over the top of the ticket. So she didn't have to necessarily move further left in order to outflank maybe some of her competitors, and instead is able to kind of move straight to that middle ground, which is where the American elections are won. This week has been quite spectacular to witness firsthand. Americans spend a lot of money on politics, and the political parties spend a lot of money putting together events like this. It is quite an extraordinary undertaking, this 4-day almost fiesta celebrating. It's a pep rally really for the Democratic Party, and drawing together not only some of the historical figures like Bill Clinton, but also some of their, and I'm sorry for all the noise around me, it's just balloons popping in case anyone's concerned at home. But it was an extraordinary bringing together of all flanks of the Democratic Party. It appeared to be perhaps some protesters or some chants, pro-Palestinian chants during the part where she addressed the war in Gaza. That does seem to be a potential divisive point in the Democratic Party. But you just get this sense that the Democrats at this point are willing to put aside any grievances they might have, any disagreements they might have within the party, because they want to beat Donald Trump. He is the unifying force for the Democratic Party, and it is a strong unifying force, and you do get this sense that that is what they are going to be campaigning on, along with issues that they believe are relatively safe politically for them, like abortion rights.
Yeah, I think the crowd rallied around any booing that, to be honest, I think you heard, Carrington. We couldn't quite, I'm not sure it was completely picked up on the microphones in the broadcast that reached us, but they certainly rallied, I think, perhaps in response to that, because there was a very loud round of applause as Kamala Harris stepped through her foreign policy thoughts on the Middle East in particular, a ceasefire and a hostage deal. Yeah.
I think what you could see from Kamala Harris was a deft attempt to bring together those two opposing views within the Democratic Party. And her line is that the hostages must be brought home, that America must continue to support Israel, but there must be a ceasefire in Gaza, and that the bloodshed must end. And that point did receive this rousing applause. Earlier, when she was focused more on October 7th, you could feel a tension in the room at that point, and that's when we heard the chants. But she was able to bring it together, and I guess that's what that is the feeling you get here, that they are more focused on what unites them. They aren't as focused on some of these issues that are obviously very painful for many people. But she, at this point at least, seems to be able to be bringing together the party, and that you think would give her a great opportunity come November to get the votes necessary in order to win this election.
Yeah, it was interesting to see, wasn't it, how front-footed she was about those things which are perceived to be her major weaknesses. So Gaza within her own party, the attacks from the Republicans, from Trump, border security. She went straight there and said that she would sign any legislation that the Republicans previously didn't agree to. National security, she spoke about her work with President Biden in Ukraine. She has had a row of speakers this morning talking about the history of the Democrats and her own experience, from the former head of the CIA to talk about Osama bin Laden being captured and killed. So it's interesting, isn't it, to see that today she was portraying herself as very safe and also tough, while couched in this kind of maternal, but I get how tough it is to raise a family.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, what we heard from Coach Walls, as they're calling him, the vice presidential nominee, last night, the metaphor he used was about them being on the offensive. And you can feel, again, when talking to delegates, people who've been around for a while, that 2016 is still a major sore point for them. They thought they were going to beat Donald Trump in 2016, and they didn't. And there is a feeling that perhaps they were playing too defensive that particular year. We're seeing Kamala Harris on the front foot. She is still going after these issues that other people might consider to be, or the Republicans might consider to be, her political weaknesses. But I do believe the overriding theme, which we saw in these slickly produced videos that were played in between speakers in the arena, the ones that received the most euphoric applause from this crowd were those that were directed at Donald Trump. They obviously believe that the opposition to Donald Trump is enough to get them across the line, as long as Kamala Harris is seen as a safe pair of hands, and that she's able to assuage any of those concerns people might have about her and her past record. So I think that's what tonight was all about. And it seems there was no major stumbles. It appeared that she was able to get through it unscathed. And I think the people who are excited about her would take even greater excitement from the way she performed this evening.
Right, and there's another question as well, isn't there, about how Donald Trump is going to respond to this now. He was telling reporters, I'm not watching the convention, I'm not interested in the convention, but indeed he has been watching the convention. He tweeted, we're told, or he posted on Truth Social when she was speaking, saying, where's Hunter? And has already been on Fox News to say, oh, you know, she's not done anything in her time as vice president in terms of the things she's been complaining about, and again spoke to border security and immigration. For observers like us, that seems like, oh, you're reverting to the same old tropes again. But we do know that they are the areas that she is most exposed on and that a lot of Americans are very concerned about.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Excuse me. Polls still suggest that the state of the economy, particularly inflation, the economy fundamentals have improved a great deal in the last couple of years in terms of inflation is no longer growing at the rate that it was. But when people look at how much things cost today versus what they cost 3.5 years ago, you can see it. You can see how much it's increased, and it takes a while for people to get used to this new norm. Although tonight we heard from Kamala Harris this plan about middle-class tax cuts and talked about this so-called Trump tax, the idea of Donald Trump whacking tariffs on imports to the country and how they're going to hurt people when they go to buy their essentials. That is still a weak point for the Democrats. And immigration is, again, one of these divisive issues within the Democratic Party. In some ways, they're fortunate that Donald Trump rejected this bipartisan deal that was put forward by Democrats and Republicans. He didn't want to give a win to the Democrats, but it means that she's able to campaign with a clear policy, which is that we will go back to the agreement that was already agreed to by the Republicans and Democrats before they walked away from it. Whether or not that's enough for those people who are concerned by how many people are crossing the border remains to be seen, but it does give them the ability to have a policy that's already been clearly articulated and that they can point to. But it's clear that those are not the strong points for the Democrats, but she's doing what she can to at least remove them as being a major pain point for them as people cast their votes.
You can certainly see the political calculation that went into this speech. Carrington Clark, I can see them taking the flags and banners down around you. Great coverage by you and the team, not only through this convention, but through the Republican one as well. I'm sure you have other deadlines and commitments to meet. We'll thank you once again and say farewell. Thanks so much for joining us.
Great to speak to you all. Enjoy your evening.
Thanks, Carrington Clark there in Chicago. And he was making the point that, in many ways, the hard work begins now because Donald Trump, let's face it, will be unrelenting. We're going to go back to Casey Briggs in just a moment, Julia Baird. But why don't we do a quick recap around foreign policy? That was the subject of some mentions by David Speers, Julia and Carrington. So here was the moment when the current Vice President, but now we can say Democratic Party nominee, addressed the issue of the Middle East and the pursuit of a ceasefire and hostage deal that she's been undertaking with the current President, Joe Biden. Listen out for the crowd reaction. I'm not sure you'll pick up the booing that Carrington alluded to, but here it was.
At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination. And know this, I will never hesitate to take whatever action is necessary to defend our forces and our interests against Iran and Iran-backed terrorists. I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump. Because, they know he is easy to manipulate with flattery and favors. They know Trump won't hold autocrats accountable because he wants to be an autocrat himself. And as president, I will never waver in defense of America's security and ideals because in the enduring struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs.
Yeah, so it did draw a rousing response, and it was carefully constructed, I think, as Julia Baird had pointed out earlier, as a continuation of Biden administration foreign policy. Look, David Speers is still standing by in our Canberra studios. You touched on this a little earlier too, David, just around that direct address to what's happening in the Middle East, the desire to bring that towards, if not a conclusion, then at least some sort of pause. It remains elusive, though, for the current Vice President and Joe Biden himself.
Oh, it does. And Joe Biden and no doubt Kamala Harris would like nothing more than to have that ceasefire finalised, done, before the election. Whether Netanyahu wants it done before the election is another question. But look, you heard the nominee say there she knows where the US stands between the choice of tyranny and democracy. I suppose in this current conflict, though, in Gaza, where does the US stand? Where do the Democrats stand? In between the two sides of this conflict, this war. The US, the Biden administration, is still arming Israel every day. And yet you hear Kamala Harris there talk about wanting to maintain the dignity, end the devastation. And look, ultimately, the camera cut away, but she did use the line there about self-determination for the Palestinian people. Now, that is reinstating support for a two-state solution. That's important. That's not something Benjamin Netanyahu is necessarily supportive of at the moment. Donald Trump, we don't hear use that language much. I don't know if all you guys might have a better idea of that. But I did think that was notable, that she's laid out there in this convention speech that she wants to see that two-state solution of self-determination for the Palestinian people. But it's such a vexed issue for the Democrats. You could hear a bit of the heckling there. We see that with the Albanese government, the Labor Party here in Australia as well. Ultimately, is this going to be a vote-changing issue? We'll see. I don't know. There's been a lot of focus on some parts of some of those battleground states where the pro-Palestinian movement is going to damage the Democrats. And look, we saw a bit of that in the UK election as well for the Labor Party there. But look, I do think Kamala Harris has laid out some markers there, and self-determination for the Palestinian people in particular was important to hear.
And I guess the question is whether she can shed some of the antipathy towards Biden from the left of the party, because she's seen as generally being more sympathetic to the idea of self-determination. We know it played a part in the primaries in Michigan and Minnesota. So it could still go on to have an impact, but I'd be interested in Casey's ideas on what the pollings have been telling us lately too.
Yeah, well, on that point, why don't we bring Casey in now then? I know he's still standing by in Washington. Yes, because as much as we might talk about protesters outside the convention, and as Julia points out, Casey, the effect on the vote in Michigan, which has a strong Palestinian or Arab Muslim population, how does it play on the data that you see more broadly across the US?
Yeah, and the question in Michigan and states like that where there is a community of significant size that is concerned about those issues, the question is going to be whether they turn up to vote, more likely than whether they vote for the alternative in Donald Trump. It's not like Australia, not like the United Kingdom where, a third-party candidate has any realistic prospect of winning the state and winning those electoral college votes in a sort of statewide race. So I think that's one question there. This issue is one of those sort of cracks of disunity in the party that has been so desperately projecting unity all week. But of course, a party that size with that kind of history is never going to be fully united. So we're talking earlier about how Kamala Harris is clawing back ground from Donald Trump. In fact, she's ahead in national polls at the moment. Does that make her the front runner? Absolutely not. I think at this point you'd say the race is you know, a toss-up, maybe with the very slight edge in Kamala Harris's favour. But in those key states, those Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Michigan and Wisconsin, it appears that she is maintaining, you know, a narrow lead in polling. The polling numbers have shifted in her favour in those states, not by as much as they have shifted further south, we should say, but they've shifted in those states. But many of them are still within the margin of error for polling. And I'll remind you, and I'll remind everyone watching, that some of those states have been the states with the biggest polling errors in recent elections. That does not mean there will be a polling error this time. That does not mean if there is a polling error, there will be a polling error in the same direction, because a polling error could equally go in Kamala Harris's favour. But there is uncertainty. That's what I'd say there. And that's why we wouldn't say that Kamala Harris is the favourite at this point. And then you head down south to those other, you know, the Sun Belt states, if you like, and the key ones that we're going to talk a lot about being Georgia, Arizona and it is escaping me what the third one is.
Nevada.
Georgia and Arizona being two, and Nevada being the other one. Sorry, been a long week. There, Kamala Harris has appeared to gain more ground on Donald Trump, and I think that partly reflects the sort of changing voter base that she's appealing most to, and where she's been able to make up ground compared to Joe Biden. Younger voters, voters of diverse backgrounds, Latino and black voters in particular, who have had concerns about Joe Biden's age predominantly being a really big issue. She has managed to make up quite a lot of ground there quite quickly. You also see that, by the way, in the donor data that we're seeing. Kamala Harris has had some very, very strong donation figures, and when you look at who is actually stepping up and making those donations, a lot of them are new donors for one. The New York Times did an analysis that showed they are tending to be younger than Joe Biden's donors, and they are coming from areas with A, higher black populations, and B, higher college-educated populations. So you're seeing a sort of shift in the focus of where that base is, and that explains some of why she's actually made those Sunbelt states, which were, many Democrats were worried were just a lost cause by the time he stepped down. All of their hopes were pinned on states like Pennsylvania and Michigan. They're definitely back in play now.
Yeah. Now, just on conventions, obviously it's a formality that you have to go through, and we've already observed in our coverage, Casey Briggs, that a great deal of effort is put into it. But is there any evidence that it's a vote shifter or it's a momentum builder in and of itself? I think I saw figures that they've been hitting roughly 20 million viewers each and every night over the 4 days of this Democratic National Convention. You've had a look at some of this data or the correlations, Casey.
I'll make 2 points, Greg. One, just a reminder that these conventions serve several purposes. There is party business happening during the day in Chicago, caucus meetings and meetings of party officials and all of that. It's the time that, you know, people from across the country get together every 4 years. So that's happening during the day. But in the evening, everyone files into that big convention centre arena for the sort of main event. About 5 hours of programming every night, the first half of which is run across cable networks in the United States and obviously is playing to the audience there. The last half is run on primetime television across the sort of broadcast networks, the American ABC, the NBC, all of the sort of main broadcasting free-to-air channels. And that is where the big audience is. A lot of people in the room, but a lot more people watching at home. 2 points about the television home audience, because if you know, there's a question about who is watching this. These are long events. These are political events. People that are maybe tuning in to watch Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune might be surprised to see this on their television on a Monday night. The evidence suggests that the people who tune in to these events are most likely to be partisan affiliated people. Registered Democrats are most likely to be watching the Democratic convention and less likely to watch the Republican one, and vice versa. Independent voters, they're the persuadable ones, and the evidence suggests from a YouGov poll that was conducted before both conventions, no more than about 40% of registered independents are watching. That's still a lot of people, so there is some room for persuasion there, but this event is also doing a lot of rallying to the supporters to build the enthusiasm to, as I was saying earlier, keep the good vibes rolling, because it's as much a sort of mobilisation exercise for the base, who they're going to be asking to do a lot of work in the next 10 or 11 weeks, or however many days it is left, and also give a lot of money. The donation calls will be coming thick and fast. So that's point number one. The other point I might just make is that more people, it seems, from the ratings data from the first couple of days of conventions, more people have been watching the Democratic convention from home than the Republican one. The Democrats have, managed to corral a longer list of celebrities and musical performances. Pink, the Chicks tonight. We had John Legend, we had Oprah Winfrey, and a whole series of others. Stack that up against the celebrity star power of the Republican convention of Kid Rock and Hulk Hogan, and it does seem like there's a little bit of a sort of imbalance in the star appeal there. There's probably also a bit of just curiosity. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are known characters in American politics for a very long time now. Kamala Harris is the new kid on the block, so to speak, and so there might be more curiosity from people just wanting to tune in to see what all the fuss is about. But if you're just looking at TV ratings as a guide for who's generating more interest, well, more people have watched the Democrats than watched the Republicans. The gap in rating in the first couple of nights at least was biggest on the second night of the convention when the Obamas spoke and headlined the event. We, of course, don't have the ratings for tonight just yet.
Look, Casey, can I just throw in a question, just picking up on your point about mobilising the base? And I think, obviously conventions on both sides are about mobilising the base. I think the speeches we've seen this week, including that one from Kamala Harris, they're really about mobilising the base. There's not a lot of, reaching out to the middle necessarily, and there's a school of thought that mobilising the base is going to be enough. If you can get enough Democrats out voting, that might be enough to win this for the Democrats. But obviously, the economy, cost of living concerns are as big a deal there as they are here. And we know in all the polling here, their number 1, 2, 3 issues are cost of living. What we heard there from Kamala Harris, there were the lines about the Trump tax and we'll give the middle class a tax cut. But I don't think she spent much time, I think it's fair to say, on this issue of inflation and cost of living. A lot of time on her backstory, yes, abortion, the dangers of Trump foreign policy we've spoken about. But, she didn't, for example, talk about her idea last week of a federal ban on price gouging in food and grocery and so on. It didn't go down terribly well. Is cost of living the biggest issue for the middle in America? And is Kamala Harris talking enough about it?
It's certainly a big issue. This week does seem to have been more about Donald Trump and his record and that, slogan that has become a catchphrase almost by accident of "we're not going back." You sort of saw it develop in real time at an early Kamala Harris rally. That's been the focus. But to your point about mobilising the base as well, David, it's been very interesting to watch the messaging shift, and you saw it really starkly this week. Joe Biden, in his address on Monday night, stuck to his consistent message about Donald Trump and about the sort of risks of another Republican presidency under him, talking about Donald Trump being a grave threat to democracy in very, very serious language. And I think that is how Joe Biden and his closest advisors thought the message would, best cut through to the public. But you've seen a shift in the way that message has been delivered, the language and the sort of rhetoric around it that I think is appealing, an attempt to appeal more to the people in the middle, the perhaps persuadable voters, the perhaps the Republicans who, Republican voters who think, or, people who might lean Republican who think, didn't mind his policies all that much, but gosh, it's such a performance and I'm just a bit sick of the guy. And there are people like that here in the United States. We saw, we've seen that for a little while now with comments about Donald Trump and his supporters being weird. We saw that from Barack Obama on Tuesday, him very much taking a different sort of line of attack than Joe Biden. Barack Obama talked, compared Donald Trump to the guy with the leaf blower outside who wouldn't shut up, in a real sort of attempt to paint him in that light, in a light that it maybe is sort of more appealing to the, Republican-leaning independents and the persuadable Republican voters who don't really hate his policies all that much, but are just a bit sick of the man. He's a very polarising figure in American politics, and it's been interesting to watch that tack as well. But you're right, inflation's been this massive issue in the United States. I can't imagine Kamala Harris going the rest of this campaign without having to talk about these issues. It's been a sort of pointed element of the campaign, element of the sort of political menu of issues that really she's been ignoring and has not been something that's featured on the agenda this week. We've thought law and order, we've seen gun violence tonight was a big theme, we've seen Donald Trump as a big theme.
Look, it's all stacked before the Democrats from here, isn't it? I'll just throw in my own historical observation here, Casey Briggs. Only 6 vice presidents have been elected to president. 9 have made the transition, but most of those have been via deaths or resignations. The successful ones usually take a gap, and Joe Biden would be the best and most recent example of that, taking a break between their vice presidency and their tilt at the presidential race. That's not a luxury that Kamala Harris, alas, gets to be afforded. That's not the hand that history has dealt her here in 2024. Look, as usual, Casey, you've brought us some brilliant analysis. We have a bit of maintenance to do here in our broadcast, so we'll wrap it up there and no doubt get some further thoughts from you. Doing a great job there in Washington, D.C. Our elections analyst, Casey Briggs, thanks so much. All right, so Julia, Baird and I will continue our coverage. We've wrapped up official proceedings in Chicago, Illinois, but there are still further perspectives that we want to bring you in our ongoing coverage of the launch of the Harris Waltz campaign. Now, we welcome viewers on ABC TV in Western Australia. Now, if you're just joining us, you're watching special coverage of Kamala Harris's Democratic National Convention speech, where Ms Harris has formally accepted the Democrat Party nomination for president with a pledge to lead for all Americans. She touted her achievements as vice president and described the election as a fleeting opportunity to move beyond bitterness, cynicism and division. Ms Harris's speech, which lasted only 41 minutes by my calculation, also reaffirmed support for allies internationally, including Ukraine, and that the administration she would currently be vice president in, but hoping to lead, would continue working to end the war in Gaza. Kamala Harris also spoke of the importance of abortion rights and vowed to bring back a border security bill that had been rejected by Republicans. Julia Baird, ABC broadcaster, writer and long-time watcher of politics in the US, is with our other analysts. We've heard from Casey Briggs so far. We've had, and still have, David Speers in Canberra. But Julia, it kind of did what it needed to do. The hard part, as I earlier mentioned, the historical difficulty of jumping from vice president to president. The hard part really begins.
Oh, so much work to do now, and you could see that in so many of the delegates, and especially Michelle Obama towards the end going, yeah, everything feels good now. But you watch what is thrown at this candidate. You watch the attacks on her and the lies and the things that will be said, and you will need to understand that your candidates will make mistakes, but that they will endeavour to lead with decency and with all those kinds of things. So
I think you've written elsewhere about, at least in the confines of the convention, a deliberate attempt to bring grace to the tone of Democratic campaigning. But what you're saying now is that may not count for much beyond Chicago.
I don't know, I really jumped up out of my seat when Barack Obama, firstly Michelle Obama used that word, the fact that they would lead with grace. And then Barack Obama used the same word. And it is actually not a reframing, it's a re-emergence of an old way to talk about politics, to get away from the divisions. We've noticed this again and again throughout this convention, saying you might disagree with people, but you have to understand they're fellow Americans. Like we coach community football together. We're down at the same school together. We volunteer together. We hear about moments like Marion Robinson, Michelle Obama's mother, who volunteered for many years at the local school, that kind of unglamorous, unpaid, thankless work that this country kind of spins on. So to me, we were talking before, I think David made a really good point about no direct mention of the cost of living, which is kind of a weak point for them, because despite the improvements in the economy, a lot of Americans don't believe that they've been better off, or that President Biden has done a good job there. So instead of directly saying, oh, the economy was this way when we took over and now it's this, or going into metrics, they've gone into the vibe of the thing, which is we get what it's like to financially struggle. We get what it's like to have humble origins. I grew up, said Kamala Harris, on the flats of Oakland. There's talk of Donald Trump's gold escalator. There's talk of his, billionaire friends and his cushioned surrounds from birth. And to me, I think that's what they're trying to say. We are one of you, and your struggles we understand. Well framed. And that also comes out in the very overt reference to the middle class. I mean, Kamala Harris used that phrase herself smack bang in the middle of this speech as she bridged across economic policy and values. Hold further thoughts just for a moment, Julia. We want to bring in our panel now. So joining us for their analysis on Kamala Harris's speech and the US election race ahead is US and global environmental politics expert Dr. Emma Shortis from the Australia Institute. Welcome, Emma.
Hi.
And former Democratic Kansas State Senator Donald Betts. Donald, welcome to you too. I might go to you first. Emma, you can make general observations if you wish, but can I just pose the question that one word, enough, seems to spring to mind to me as I watch this. Does Kamala have enough time? Does Harris have enough fresh ideas? Has she built up enough familiarity and political identity to get her through these next 10 weeks? What do you think on that?
It's such a good question, Greg, because I actually wonder if the lack of time is not partly an advantage to Kamala Harris. There's been so much kind of noise about how she needs to introduce herself to the American people. She needs to outline her policy platform. But as you've just been speaking about, we can't underestimate the importance of vibes and the fact that, Kamala Harris is quite clearly loved by the Democratic Party. We saw that in the reaction to her speech, in the tone of the whole week, and the fact that she doesn't come with baggage, even though she's been vice president, she's been kind of relatively behind the scenes, she doesn't come with all the baggage that somebody like Hillary Clinton did come with, for example. So I think in one sense that is an advantage to her, and she's using it quite deliberately in making the campaign not about her entirely. They're not focusing on firsts. They keep talking about how this is about you, this is about the American people, this is about our unity. And that, I think, is really effectively kind of flipping and attacking implicitly the individualism of Donald Trump's campaign. So I wonder if, the usual rules of politics maybe don't apply in this case.
And Donald, why don't you give us your sort of general and opening observation? I mean, you can address that question of time, whether that being shrunken is an advantage or a disadvantage, but maybe an overview, first of all, Donald Betts.
Yes, I mean, and thank you for having me on. I was at the convention 20 years ago when Obama gave that first speech about red states and blue states. And really that was the time where you push start in the election. Most Americans, as you know, don't really get involved into politics until after the primary anyway. And then if you look at the comparison with Australia and the United States, Australia has that compulsory voting, whereas U.S., you got to pretty much go sell your soul to the public in order to get a vote. In this case, with the world so used to the Snapchats and sound bites, she has plenty of time to get her message out. And then I think the real race will not begin until after the first debate. debate. That's when everyone will tune in and to assess both candidates against each other. And, you know, she's laid out the case for everyone going back home. In America, politics is local. Everyone's running for office, from the city council elections to county to state, all the way up through to the federal races. So these delegates that you see at this convention, they're going back and they're going to talk about to some of their Republican opponents, why did you vote against the bipartisan bill on the border? Why did you not support the bipartisan bill? So there's a lot to take back out of these conventions, back to the local level. But in terms of time, you can see what the Democrats was able to do with the time since Biden announced that he would not seek re-election. We've transformed it. There was a dynamic convention that rallied Democrats like never before, like, you know, similar to what I've seen back when President Obama ran in 2008. The fire is there once again, and with, like I said, the Snapchats and Instagram and Facebook, it's plenty of time to win this race.
So in Democratic terms, or demographic terms, I should say, and Democratic terms, Emma, who is that fire burning underneath? Whose vote does Kamala Harris get out with this pitch today, Emma?
Well, look, I think it's been really notable across the 4 days of the Democratic convention just how diverse the base of the Democratic Party is. And, you know, we know that Joe Biden was really struggling with young voters in particular and voters of colour, particularly because of some of his positions on Israel. And I think we can see on the convention floor just how inspiring Harris is to those particular demographics. And that will be really important in some pretty important swing states as well, places like Georgia, where the African American vote can be critical, you know, and was critical across the country to Joe Biden's victory. So I think that will be a real focus of Harris's. But we can also see, I think, of course, with her pick of Tim Walz as her running mate, that she's looking to build and is building a really broad coalition of the Democratic Party and reaching outside it as well. So their focus, I think, is an interesting one because it is really ambitious and it is really broad. It's not focused, you know, only on the Rust Belt or the Blue Wall. It's focused on the Sun Belt as well. And so I think they've, in terms of the convention, pitched that particularly well this week.
I'm also interested in, at the risk of being accused of talking about identity politics, which is obviously something she doesn't want to do, I'm really interested in the way she didn't address those things head on tonight. Whereas Emma, first of all, she did speak, we did see Hillary Clinton very heavily leaning into the lineage. Shirley Chisholm, the suffragettes, people that went before, and that they just had to keep going. And again, the reference to the mothers. A lot of talk of mothers in this convention. Like, what did you make of then Kamala Harris appearing sober, tough, determined, warm? It's such a difficult line for women in politics to often walk, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think, Julia, it's really interesting to reflect on how much those identity politics have changed across the last, you know, 8 or maybe 10 years, because that's part of that identity, that sort of focus on women, has also focused on women's anger. And that's not something that particularly black women have been able to do on a national stage until very recently. I think it was so notable that Michelle Obama leaned into that righteous anger. And it's extraordinary the way the campaign has reclaimed that and has flipped so many things. You know, they've flipped anger, and I think they've flipped identity politics as well, you know, by not talking about being the first, with the exception of Hillary Clinton, of course. What they do is shine the spotlight on Donald Trump's identity politics and his focus on identity, on race, on women, you know, his accusations that Kamala Harris isn't black, or she can only be black or only be Indian. By not addressing those issues directly, but by kind of living them and focusing on women and women's rights and women's anger, again, they're able to flip that narrative in a way that, at least for now, Donald Trump and Republicans have just been completely unable to respond to.
All right, I've got some further questions and I might put them to you, Donald, in just a moment. If you can just stand by. It is Friday afternoon, and for our colleague David Speers, that means commitments as our national politics lead, but also, of course, the preparation of insiders for this weekend. I know, David, you might have places to be fairly soon, so I'll get some final observations from you before we go back to Emma and Donald. I guess... I was going to ask about policies, David. They weren't sort of thick on the ground in this pitch today, and we've heard a lot in our coverage from Casey Briggs and others about running on the vibe, at least for the short term. Do you think that part of the puzzle is yet to be filled out, or they won't bother about that till they get past November?
I mean, Greg, you can see why they're doing that for now. It's working. I mean, this has been such an extraordinary political shift that we've seen in the transition from Biden to Harris, and they're going to stick with that strategy, right? Now, what we don't know is whether the honeymoon goes forever, right through to November, or whether there will be a need to get out there with interviews, explanations, policy details, press conferences and so on, and get into the tough stuff. Look, I suspect, yes, that will happen at some point. It has to happen at some point, and that's where the more complicated points will come, whether it's on Gaza, whether it's on cost of living, whether it's on a lot of these areas. But right now, what we saw tonight there in the United States was a pretty classy performance, a very tightly scripted, well-delivered performance, capping off what really has been a great convention for the Democrats, no doubt about it. It's about mobilising the base, as we've said. What's going to be done, if needed, to win over the middle, those who are disengaged, who aren't watching this sort of stuff, that's what we're yet to see. But you can see why the Democrats are so excited at the moment and why Donald Trump still seems to be struggling to find his line on how to respond to all this.
Well, it's on. There's no doubt about that. David Speers, as always, we thank you for your insights and analysis. We'll say farewell and see you again shortly. All right, David Speers, Insiders host and ABC national politics lead, joining us there from Canberra. Donald Betts, as promised to you, I did want to come back just on that question that I put to David, I suppose, with a slight twist on it. Should we be holding our breath for any further pronouncements from the Harris-Walz campaign, about the economy, the details stuff, beyond what she laid out in a speech in North Carolina a week ago?
Absolutely. You'll see the policy papers coming out pretty soon. In fact, I just went onto the website to see if they've loaded them up. I was assuming that they would have them loaded up as soon as she finished speaking, but I can assure you that the policy papers will be loaded on the website. They're just, I believe, raising the last bits of money. I mean, when I was at the convention, after the convention and the pleasantries, it's back to the fundraising and after parties and the governors have a party, and then there's fundraising there. So right now in Chicago, I can assure you there's a lot of checks being written and a lot of money being raised. But I believe by next week you'll see those policies laid out. And just back to, when you talk about the dynamics of race in this particular election. Yeah, so if when you get a chance to Google AKA or Alpha Kappa Alpha, it's known and widely known in the African American community that Kamala Harris is a member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority incorporated, and it's you'll find that a lot of those brilliant sorority sisters are judges and lawyers and doctors and executives of some of the top universities. But she's also from an HBCU, and every African Americans across the nation know she's from an HBCU, that she's an Alpha Kappa Alpha. So she doesn't have to sell that too much in the African American community, in the minority communities. And the fact that she's a Tamil Indian, she crosses borders from the Sri Lankan Tamils and the Tamils in India and Tamiladin in South India. The fact that she has that conservative upbringing from a Tamil woman, the Tamil people know that it's quite conservative conservative and highly educated. So, I mean, there's a lot that she doesn't have to say because it's known within those communities who she is. Now she needs to sell to the Midwest, and she has that in Governor Walz. She needs to make sure she, covers the states that are she's gonna struggle with, like Arizona, Nevada, and Michigan, and Wisconsin, and Atlanta, Georgia, and in Georgia. She has the race stuff covered. Now it's up for Donald Trump to continue to damage himself by getting it wrong. Calling her, saying that she's not black. When Black America knows she's black, or saying that she's not this or that. When America knows Kamala Harris, they just don't know her on an international scale. We know Kamala.
That's so interesting. So you're arguing that she doesn't really have to necessarily very strategically think about it, what it means to be a black woman, because you think it's so clear. She's made so clear who she is.
Everyone knows she's an Alpha Kappa Alpha. I'm a member of Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, a traditional African-American fraternity and sorority. We know who she is. We've seen her at conventions and speaking at the different conventions and raising money for young girls, African-American girls in the community that Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority supports. So it's known, and these sisters are very powerful, formidable women, very professional, highly educated women who will be writing big checks to Kamala.
Yeah, well, Donald Trump will be out there, of course, muddying the waters. He's done that. I think Julia observed earlier in our coverage that he hasn't quite got the line and length, as we would say in cricketing terms here in Australia, on Kamala Harris yet, but he's continuing to work away at it. Look, great observations from both of you. Donald Betts, Emma Shortis, we thank you so much for joining our coverage. Much more we could discuss. We didn't even get to questions like, is Kamala Harris brat? But we've got to leave something. We've got to leave something.
The answer.
Oh, the answer is yes,
yeah.
I'm assured.
Yeah.
Got to leave something in the tank for the next 10 weeks. So we'll come back to some further questions. Emma, Donald, thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
And Julia, thanks to you too.
Always a pleasure.
We will know in November just how historic this day was, but it was certainly pulled off with full pageantry and colour, as the Democrats have done all week. All right, this is where we're going to leave our special coverage of Kamala Harris's speech at the National Democratic Convention and her acceptance of their nomination. I'm Greg Jennett. Thanks for your company. Here's Ros Childs now with the rest of the day's news.